All right, well, welcome to another Miami Project Wednesday seminar series lecture. I think this is my third. The first was in 2016. I'm David McMillan. I am a newly onboarded assistant professor and the director of education and outreach here at the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis. And so I will be talking to you today about a research project, but also that includes an approach that I'm hoping we can all start to, more efficiently implement here. And so the title of this talk is A Community Research Partnership to Address Hurricane Preparedness in South Floridians Living with Spinal Cord Injury. So we'll start, this is just basically a roadmap, and we'll start by discussing a little bit of background. Oh, there we go. Why we're talking about these two topics of hurricane preparedness and spinal cord injury. We will talk about the development of a resource packet through the South Florida Spinal Cord Injury Model Systems, the Department of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation here at the Miller School, and the Miami Project. We will then talk about engaging community partners to develop a research approach to address the question the questions that arise from hurricane preparation and spinal cord injury. We'll show the results of the inaugural season of that research project that will be ideally ongoing indefinitely until there are no longer hurricanes. And then we will talk about moving forward, what our plans are. And when we do that, we'll zoom out a little bit and talk about taking this research partnership approach and applying it to other activities here at the Miami Project. Okay, so I like to use the phrase, the saying, Southeast Florida is a lighthouse for people with spinal cord injuries. And you could apply this to, I think, mobility impairment in general, but spinal cord injury specifically. And there's four primary reasons why I think that's the case. So the first is that Florida is flat. This is an elevation map of the United States. Green colors are low-lying areas. Darker brown colors are high-lying areas, and changes in color are differences in elevation. And you can see almost all of Florida is green, and it's all the same color green. And so hills are a major inconvenience if you're in a mobility device. And so this is one reason why people might want to move here once they end up with a mobility impairment. Also, Florida is warm. And I think more important than that is to say that it is snowless, and snow and or icy conditions do not go well with mobility devices. And so here's a heat map of the United States showing that in certain areas, while it's very cold, it will still be quite warm here. And in Miami, we are in fact classified as a subtropical environment. So we have, instead of the 4 seasons in the rest of the United States, we have a wet and a dry season. There is no state income tax in Florida, one of the 6 states in the contiguous U.S. where this is the case. And as we all know, living with a spinal cord injury is quite expensive. And so this is one incentive to move here. While you're still going to incur the expenses, there's no state tax on them. And then importantly, and very timely, Miami, here at the University of Miami, we are a spinal cord injury model system. And congratulations to our team, including the director and PI, Dr. Elizabeth Felix, for getting this spinal cord injury model systems funding renewed for the next 5-year funding cycle. And we heard word of this at the end of August. And congratulations also to the co-PIs and co-directors, Dr. David Gator and Dr. Mark Nash, both of whom will come up in this conversation. And so us being a spinal cord injury model system, if you have a spinal cord injury, you know that you can get good spinal cord injury medicine here. And also you can participate in what is now one of the 14 leading care and research centers for SCI in the United States. All of that is contrasted with a reality. And this is a picture, satellite image from last year, when there were 5 concurrent named tropical storms, 3 in the Atlantic Basin, 1 going up the Atlantic seaboard in the US, and 1 in the Gulf. And so you have, on one hand, this situation where there are a lot of reasons for someone in a wheelchair with a spinal cord injury specifically to move to South Florida. And then you have this occurrence, this potential climate emergency that is really not conducive to being in a wheelchair. And so here, just as an example of last season was somewhat unique in this. But the number of named storms, these are plotted, so they call this a spaghetti plot, that have made landfall in Florida since my birth year in 1989. And so you can see here from this NOAA Hurricane Historical Tracker, that's been 50 named storms. And granted, not all of those are in South Florida, and not all of those are in Miami-Dade County, but we're averaging, just under 2 a year that are making landfall in Florida. And this is a major concern to people living here in general, and especially to people with spinal cord injuries. So to lay the background on why specifically you have a spinal cord injury, this is a major concern. There are a lot of medical logistic considerations in this population. So both durable medical supplies and consumables. So from a DME standpoint, if you are on a ventilator, that requires electricity. The mobility component of this, both power manual wheelchairs and or things like walkers, I'll show you a video in the slide right after this, are made for a very limited range of applications. There are many self-care considerations. When it comes to bathing and toileting, special commodes and shower chairs are required. The commode would be the seat that goes over the toilet that allows for a bowel routine, most likely. And then there's sleeping considerations. Special surfaces required to avoid things like pressure ulcers and skin wounds, we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. And then from a consumable medical supply standpoint, things that you're going to need on a regular basis and that you use, and then you use another, and each time you use it, the thing is disposed of. I'll show you data from our sample from the previous year hurricane survey on how much catheterization is being used in a consumable supply standpoint. So these would be both in the form of Foley or condom catheters and intermittent catheterization. And then oral suppositories and laxatives used for bowel programs, as well as enemas. All of those are consumable. You have standard medication in the form of antispastics, which can be quite common. And keep in mind, these are both oral and implantable. So that might be like a baclofen pump that needs to be refilled at times. And then you have other medications just due to the exacerbated risk for chronic diseases in this population. And in a hurricane context, all of these are going to have to be stocked in a certain way. So just considering from a mobility standpoint perspective, I like to think of wheelchairs as like a mechanical vector to liberty, but that is only true within the narrow constraints of the built environment that they are designed to operate. And so if we take a look here, this is, I think this person's name is Allie. This is on the YouTube channel of an American Paralympic gold winning athlete. And this is, I think, one of her teammates. And so keep in mind, this person has an injury where their trunk and arms are largely spared, not paralyzed. And they're accustomed to being in a manual wheelchair and in a context that's quite athletic. Okay, so this person is going to try and go up.
No.
One moment. I think I'm sharing without sound. Sorry. Nope, we got sound.
Not.
Up a curb.
Woo! One wheel. Flip sideways. I'm running to the car. Maybe one day the HOA will put in a curb cut.
So this routine goes on for quite some time. She ends up actually falling out of her chair. And then if we are to see, this is Megan, the athlete I brought up. She'll actually make it up, but we can see the feat of athleticism, pardon for that, that's required in order to do this. And And these are in people that are relatively high functioning wheelchair users, and they're using a manual wheelchair. So let's consider this context. You have a person here who looks a little bit more prepared for a hurricane. The first question I have is, how did they get into this rain gear? Were they helped to don the rain gear? And now they're in a power chair. They're holding an umbrella. How does that do if there's a gust of wind? Also, if they need to push themselves in a manual chair, can they hold that umbrella? You then have the power chair considerations itself. The power chairs do not do well in low grip situations, like we brought up with the snow. They do not do well in confined spaces. They require power to be recharged. And also, we should keep in mind that with almost all of these power chairs, the battery and the drivetrain are at the bottom for a weight distribution consideration so that the vehicle doesn't tip over. But that also puts those large electronic components very close to the rising water level if there is flooding. And so there's a lot of these considerations due to this. There are direct and indirect morbidity and mortality considerations when it comes to hurricanes themselves. So you can have blunt trauma and drowning, which happen immediately. Drowning is the leading cause of death in hurricanes already. But specific to this population would be considerations that have to do with autonomic dysreflexia, which is a mass sympathetic reflex causing very high increase in blood pressure potentially that can lead to cerebral and pulmonary aneurysm. And then there's also thermoregulation considerations in this population, especially with high level injuries. And so at as low as, I believe, high 60-degree Fahrenheit temperatures, if someone is wet, hypothermia is a problem. And then these hurricanes are occurring in the context of us being in a subtropical environment where things can get very warm. And if you can't sweat and you can't regulate your core temperature, you could also overheat. You also have other considerations that extend beyond this. So in terms of indirect morbidity, if you think about even just respiratory infection right now in the context of COVID and hurricane sheltering, you take a large number of people, you put them in a confined space. Already, respiratory complications are one of the leading causes of death in spinal cord injury. And you now have a context where getting a respiratory infection is more common. You also have the urinary tract infections that are very common in this population that, if going untreated in the context of the aftermath of a hurricane, could lead to a negative outcome. Bowel and bladder programs have to be adhered to. And the pressure wound considerations with the skin, all in the context of sheltering or responding to a hurricane, are there. And if they're not managed, like in the case of a bowel program that is not adhered to, leading to impaction, possibly a ruptured bowel, and that leading to sepsis, there are direct morbidity considerations here. So because of this, when Dr. David Gator arrived at the University of Miami, he attended a spinal cord injury support group meeting. And during this meeting, he talked to the support group, and we'll talk about the support groups more during this presentation, about hurricanes and about what they thought about hurricanes and how they felt. And they expressed some anxieties, is the way that he has explained it to me. In response to that engagement, he had a group of PM&R medical students, or medical students with PM&R goals, develop a resource packet. And this resource packet was developed in conjunction with the Spinal Cord Injury Model Systems and the Miami Project to Cure Paralysis, and is available now for anyone on the web, as well as handouts for participants and patients who are at our facilities. And so we'll briefly go through this packet. And there's essentially 5 steps that the packet have. And some of those steps are very similar to what someone without a spinal cord injury would do, and some are very specific. And so first is going to be to register for special needs services and other regionally specific resources. So as I will show you, the group of people with spinal cord injuries in South Florida that we sampled, this educational step actually, and we developed the resource packet first, is an area of need. So we need to help with this knowledge of the registration process. Step 2 then, sorry, this is quite zoomed out, would be to determine whether or not you are going to shelter or evacuate. So evacuating requires the means to do so, such as a personal vehicle. As you will see, most of the people we sampled do actually have access to a personal vehicle. And so step 2 would be to make this decision. In most contexts, what hurricane professionals will advise is to shelter in place, although those contexts are considering the general population. And we didn't actually ask this question, but I have a feeling from people I've spoken to that the default is to evacuate if you have the ability to do so. Step 3 would be to create your emergency kit like any of us, but like we showed before, due to the durable and consumable medical equipment considerations in this population, this kit is going to be quite advanced, quite robust. And I've seen many people with spinal cord injuries, pictures of their kits and catheters and enemas, and just, I mean, it takes up so much space. And so having the means to purchase this in advance requires monetary supplies, and then you have to store them. And so this is quite a consideration, quite a burden. Keep in mind that most people are going to, at least half the people that you would think statistically would fall into this group of those with spinal cord injuries are going to require some type of care. And so this is coming in at least a dyad team, and the kit is going to apply to both of those. Okay, after this, build a support network. So this is both, you can do this through federal resources, but this is mostly local. And so this is being managed right now through our spinal cord injury support groups. And I think I can see, yeah, I believe both the presidents are here right now in this meeting. And so it's reach out, let people know where you are, let people know, if the thing happens, where you are after. And then step 5, which is very specific to this population, is practice the skills required for you to execute your plan. So if you're normally in a power chair and because of considerations for electricity, you're going to use your manual chair, when was the last time you used your manual chair? If you might be going to a shelter, you might have to transfer onto a surface using a transfer technique that you haven't done in a long time. So go ahead and practice that in home in a controlled environment so that you can execute those skills afterwards. And then we have tri-county regionally specific resources. And there's quite some difference between the county you're living in, with Dade being the largest by far in terms of the number of people that they manage through their emergency assistance program. And then moving all the way up to Palm Beach County. We unfortunately did not engage Monroe County in this. Monroe County is classified as a rural area and a medically underserved area. And due to that, the resource allocation that they have is very low. And my advice to most people in Monroe County would be to drive north if this is happening. Okay, so we have this phenomena that occurs. We have realized a need to respond to this due to our engagement of the support groups. And so after that, we went through the process of engaging these community partners in a research partnership to use science as a means to address part of this problem. So here very briefly, I will show you a video that's advertising essentially what is slowly emerging as the primary resources and how to do this in spinal cord injury. So
Research partnerships have been championed as a way to close the gap between research and practice. Despite calls for there to be nothing about us without us, spinal cord injury researchers have often been accused of using a tokenistic approach to partnership. To support meaningful spinal cord injury research partnerships, a multidisciplinary group co-developed Integrated Knowledge Translation, IKT, guiding principles. The 8 principles were rigorously developed using literature reviews and consensus methods. By using the principles, you have the potential to overcome tokenism and improve the impact of spinal cord injury research. To learn more, connect with us.
Okay, so this approach is not specific to any one population. And is often referred to as maybe community-based participatory research. But IKT is the term that has come about in our field. And so we identified our community partners as the support groups, plural, that we had previously engaged just to discuss the topic of hurricane preparedness. And so we engaged them, and this is essentially how it went. There were 3 meetings that we attended. These were the standard SCI support group meetings. And during those meetings, keep in mind, we were a guest. And so the support groups did agree to talk about the topic of hurricane preparedness. But we were there and they were going about their normal meeting routines as well. And then, as you can see, some of these meetings went quite some time. So some were quick, as short as about 45 minutes, and others went quite some time. And that would be most of the attendees had left at that time, and 2 people had really important feedback they wanted to give or questions or something like this. So in general, there were about 6 to a dozen support group members. So those are the people with spinal cord injuries who are in the support group. And then at various times, there were different partners that were coming in, both from the University of Miami and out. So myself, Dr. David Gator, like I said, and Dr. Elizabeth Felix were the 3 Miami Project researchers who attended these meetings. And I don't think there was a time when all 3 of us attended at the same time. The 2 medical students, that was Caleb and Marissa, both attended a meeting. 1 student from the Abbess Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy, a Ph.D. student named Lene, attended a meeting as well. And then at one point, we had a Miami-Dade County employee from the Office of Emergency Management who attended, both to address she gave a short presentation to the group itself, but also to address some questions that we as the researchers have so that we could, I guess, probe appropriately about their resources in the survey that we developed. So there were some survey questions that existed before the meetings that didn't change in response to the meetings, but there was one specific area, if you will, that we had not thought to ask about, that in response to the engagements, we knew that we had to ask more about. And I'll show you what we got in response to that. Really, it's some really rich data that we would not have otherwise gotten. So the primary research objective that emerged from the partnership that didn't exist before was to ask about the question, what is the experience of using the services? So not just, do you know about the services? Not just, are you using the services? But if you do use them, what is it like? Okay, and now we're into the data. So I'll show you some tables with some demographics, and then I'll show you the survey responses. And we had in total 59 full responses, although some of the questions were conditional, and I'll show you those. So of the 59 responses, it turned out there were actually only 3 users who had engaged with the resources in the context of responding to a hurricane. And so really have to think about why there is such low resource utilization. And that's going to be the theme of the conclusions here. In general, you have mostly middle-aged males in this population with chronic spinal cord injuries, about 50% paraplegia, 50% tetraplegia, which we would expect, skewed a little bit higher on the side of cervical injuries, about 50% complete and 50% incomplete of the people who did know their ASIA. But look here in terms of the responses, their ASIA impairment scale, more appropriately known as the INSCI exam. 40 people reported not knowing their INSCI score, which is something we have separate protocols open to address, but this is quite common. The primary mobility was about 50% manual wheelchair and 50% power wheelchair. Most people had access to a private vehicle, so that is very important when it comes to step 2 of the hurricane response. Are you going to shelter or evacuate? This might give you the ability to evacuate. Quite a range of employment, marital status, education. This was across the board like we would expect in any population. Within that subpopulation, there's quite a diversity. Okay, with respect to bowel and bladder, so we asked about this because we're getting at some of those consumable medical supplies. So most of the people for their bladder management are using intermittent catheterization, which is going to require a stock for an unknown amount of time if you are planning to respond to a hurricane. And then when it comes to the bowel program, most people are using digital stimulation or evacuation, which usually in order to access the area requires a special toileting chair, which you might not have access to if you're not in your personal home or residence. And then other people are using suppositories and enemas, which were quite common. And these are consumable medical supplies. Keep in mind that it came out to about 15% of the population had some type of surgical intervention to manage their bowel or bladder. And so with these, it can quite often be the case that there is instrumentation entering the body. And so there's a site that needs to be maintained. So infection's a consideration there if you're in a non-sterile environment for a prolonged period of time. Okay, so we're about 30 minutes in. This is good timing. I will now go through the survey responses, and I'll break them down so we can go over the survey questions and the responses individually by these categories. And so there were three main categories of questions that we had. The first was personal capacity, is how we summarize that category. The second, which will represent in yellow, resource knowledge. And the final that'll be represented in this dark teal was comfort, or the inverse of what Dr. Gator had identified as the anxiety that people were experiencing around this. All are on a visual analog scale from 0 to 100. So the survey was electronic, and the participants could click and drag a selector to pick a number anywhere between 0 and 100. And so we actually did some pilot testing with different scales, and we asked some of the participants or the potential participants to interact with the scales and see, based on their reduced hand function, or if they were having a caregiver do the actual survey responses for them, what would be better. And most people responded and said the slider was best. And so that's what we went with. Okay, so if we move into the personal capacity category, we can see here that most people in general, when you see this scale, 100 is going to be that they have a favorably agreeable response, and 0 is going to be that they have a disfavorable response. And so most people are agreeing that their personal capacity, that they perceive this as being quite adequate, quite high. Keep in mind, like if we look at this question in the middle, I know how to communicate my needs to a person other than my caretaker. This is a highly skewed response. So most people, you can look at the box and whisker plot, the median and the 25th quartile are almost overlapping. Most people are saying that they feel very confident doing this. However, look at the number of outliers. The people who don't feel comfortable doing this are going to have a major problem when it comes to group sheltering, when it comes to responding to a situation if they get separated from their caregiver. So while most people do feel comfortable, we really need to address those that don't. In general, the rest of these responses are basically showing high personal capacity. But when we look at some of the further responses, we're going to see that this perception of high personal capacity doesn't necessarily track with the rest of the data. Okay, so if we get into resource knowledge, so this is an area where the packet that was developed and also further educational approaches can address this. And so I know how to register with the Federal Special Needs Registry, which is step 1 in what I showed you in the packet in terms of preparing for a hurricane. You can see that most people did not know how to do this. They are aware of the local emergency special needs services. Most people also were not aware of these. They're aware, that was state. Local, about half of the people were aware of these. And then when it comes to moving on from that to the things that you would have experienced if you had gone through any hurricanes, such as receiving live updates, determining which evacuation zone you're in, and then getting information, most people felt that they were quite comfortable with that. So about a 75 out of 100 on the VAS. And now if we move to the comfort, you can see that most of the box and whisker plots are on the low end here of the VAS scale, meaning that people were not comfortable or did feel anxious about these. And if we just zoom out and look at the trend as a whole here, you can see that the personal capacity, most people are giving a favorable response. And with the comfort, they're giving a disfavorable response. And so there's this disconnect between how they feel they can respond and how they're feeling while they're responding. And this is something that we need to drill into, and something that the questions that were put into the survey due to the research partnership helped to shed a little bit of light on. So in a conditional form, going through the survey, if you answered yes to having used the services, you were taken to these questions. And we'll go through these like we did before with the two sections individually. But like I said before, only 3 people had actually engaged with the resources. And so the first part of these questions are asking about their experience engaging with transportation services. And keep in mind, this is while responding to a hurricane emergency. This is not in general. And so one participant said that they had a good experience using the transportation resources during a hurricane. And the other 2 participants said they had a strongly disagreeable experience using the resources. We did have a fill box, and one of the participants did enter some information into the fill box. And they said that the experience was analogous to being a cattle loaded into cattle cart. And I presume that could be said about STS experiences in many contexts, but that was used here. There was one participant who used the special needs shelters. And so keep in mind, we had 72 total surveys that were initiated, 59 fully usable data, and we did not put a constraint on how long that the responses were going back to in terms of the years in which these hurricane resources were engaged. So it's pretty amazing that only one person had tried to access a special needs service. And that person, as you see here, reports having a quite disfavorable experience. They also in the fill box reported that they were transferred onto what they identified as an army bed instead of a hospital bed in this context, and developed 4 smaller skin wounds, and that took over 6 months to heal in total upon returning to their home after the hurricane had gone through, and that the healing process was primarily undertaken by their caregiver, who's also their partner, and not by medical professionals or someone related to the shelter. So if we look at this data as a whole, the total low utilization of the services, then the disconnect between this feeling of capacity and yet at the same time anxiety, and then these special or these standalone use cases. What is emerging from this in terms of a follow-up research question is this right here. So what is the relationship between these individual negative experiences and the collective low service utilization? And this we can get at through a more in-depth approach, such as interviews. And so to summarize this in another way would be, is the experience of a few driving the vicarious expectations of the whole in terms of this failure to deliver? And so that seemed to be the main thing, is that people just didn't have trust in these resources because there was reputational damage due to the experiences of a couple people. So one person went, they used them, they came back, they said that didn't go well. They let everyone know, and now no one's going to the special needs shelters, which places the burden of response onto the individuals, and they already have an increased burden due to these medical logistics. So to continue, the results of this have been written up and submitted to the forthcoming inaugural issue of a journal that is very locally specific. So the journal is titled Subtropical and Tropical Coastal Resilience, and is actually developed by University of Miami researchers. In response to this, as well as engaging the community by going to them and meeting them where they meet, we also are disseminating the results of this study in a way that we think is appropriate for the community. So both, as well as having a technical scientific manuscript coming from it, we made a podcast episode where we interviewed both the Miami-Dade Office of Emergency Management personnel, people from the community with the lived experience of spinal cord injuries, and the researchers, including the medical students who were really boots on the ground with this. And I'll play for you a short clip from that right now. This is not the full episode, by the way.
The big headline in Miami-Dade tonight, there is a mandatory evacuation order.
All this is storm surge.
More street signs flying across the road right now.
A new study finds in 2017, Hurricane Irma killed more than 400 seniors living in Florida nursing homes.
I'm a paraplegic, they're quadriplegic, there are some people need oxygen, some people might need a nurse, so it depends on the individuals. Some of my friends that don't drive or don't have whatever, they rely on the Miami-Dade County transportation to pick them up and go to a shelter, hoping that they find a bed or they can do their personal needs and all that stuff like that. So it gets difficult.
So that was Anson James, Miami-Dade Support Group's president. And you can find that podcast episode on the internet, and it is quite telling. So now to continue pursuing this topic, we are submitting a ULink application, which is an intramural funding source that is designed to connect different entities within the University of Miami. And they have a specific RFA, a call for a resilience challenge that we think that this is very, very appropriate for. And this will be a collaboration between actually all three campuses, Catherine Mock at the Abbas Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy, including her student Lene that I brought up previously, and then myself and Trevor Green on the Coral Gables campus, who is School of Communication faculty and one of the experts that helped with the production of that podcast episode I showed you. And so the updated approach for this season includes making it so that the questionnaire can start to probe it. Why are you not using the resources if you're not using them, which is the majority of people? So we have added that, and we will deploy the survey again at the end of the season. Proposed for the 2022 season, funding contingent would be the addition of qualitative interview approaches to try and get some richer data from these participants, especially those who have used the resources. And then beyond this, there are many other approaches that we could apply from a research standpoint. But this is, I think, an example of two things where this use case can be used to understand a larger paradigm and a larger approach. So the first would be this concept of universal design. So why, if there are, from just a general population statistical standpoint, so few people living with spinal cord injuries, would we cater to this population if it is not going to meet the median needs of the people writ large? And from the standpoint of universal design, one way to think about this is if you cater to the population that has, from a physical standpoint, the highest needs, you've also catered to every population above them, regardless of the population above them's abilities. And so essentially, if you design a system so that someone with a cervical spinal cord injury in a power wheelchair can utilize that system effectively and independently, you have designed that system so that almost every other person on earth can use that system. And so I think that's very important to think about from the standpoint of resources designed to address hurricane preparedness, because there are a lot of people across a whole spectrum of intellectual and cognitive disabilities who all have to respond to a hurricane. And so catering to this use from a universal design perspective, this spinal cord injury specific use, could help all of those people. And then to zoom out even further, and especially with respect to this being a Miami Project Wednesday seminar, I think this project in particular has been an example of how to engage community partners in the research process. And so this is often referred to as the IKT wheel. And so you have 6 points, 6 primary, if you will, nodes or areas where research occurs in a cyclical process. And so if you look here at the green, the funding application, this is often where most of us have experience with engaging people with spinal cord injuries due to funding application requirements, such as having, I think they're usually called lived consultant advisors on the application. But to set up a system or a process where at any one of these points, people with spinal cord injuries could be engaged to give feedback on maybe, hey, what does my data mean? Or, hey, how do you want to hear about the results of this study? Or, hey, am I asking the right question? I know how to test the thing, but I don't know if I'm testing the right thing. And so at any point in this process, to be able to engage people with spinal cord injuries, unless you just happen to have a lot of friends in wheelchairs, it doesn't seem that simple. And so an initiative that I'm putting forth that is underway is to develop a council so that all Miami Project researchers who are already engaged in this research cycle, or all of us who are Miami Project researchers are engaged in this research cycle, can have a way to request that feedback at any step in the cycle. And so Anson James, Ryan Gebauer, and myself are the founders of this council. Right now, the application is open for the inaugural, we're not sure if it'll be year, but the inaugural season of the council. There will be 8 sustaining contributors on the council at all times. All 8 of those people will have spinal cord injury or disease. And then obviously any Miami Project researcher can engage them. So that's the 2 sides of the Venn diagram. The council members will be selected based on their interest and experience. There are 3 questions in the application that probe at those. And then depending on demand, the council members can pull in guest contributors. If there's a big project or a project that is highly specialized in some way, or a number of projects where requests are given back to back, then they can pull in guest contributors. And then in terms of the structure of the rules of engagement, if you will, there will probably be some routine meetings, maybe quarterly, probably just to handle mostly council business. And then mostly the council will respond on an as-need basis to requests put forth by the researchers to ask them for feedback on any one of those 6 steps in the cycle. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Should give us about 15 minutes for questions. And thank you guys so much, both for hearing about this project with the hurricanes and also the broader topic of engaging community partners in research. I think I'll stop share, yeah.
This is Vance. I have a question.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey,
Let me-
let me turn my camera or stand up or change my table. So I think the community engagement thing is super cool. And I'm wondering how you think researchers such as myself might be able to take advantage of it. And let me give you an example. Hassan and John and I hope that the project that we're working on someday will lead to a clinical trial. But I wonder what kind of data would a person with a spinal cord injury want to see to feel some confidence to participate in a trial? Would that mean we would have to add a different kind of animal study, a different kind of outcome measure that might not be required by the FDA, but might be essential to make our clinical trial successful because we could recruit people to want to be part of the trial?
I mean, that's precisely what this mechanism is for. I wonder as well as you do what the answer to that question is. I know there are some hints. So there was a survey-based study conducted by Dr. Kim Anderson, who previously occupied my position, looking at perceived barriers and also facilitators to participation in clinical trials by people with spinal cord injury. So I think that can give us a hint. But I think part of this council, what's strong about it and what goes far beyond how I would have designed it. So this was so similarly to develop the council, we had a number of meetings and I quantified all those meetings. And so the people on the council are most likely going to be local. And I think that is super strong because, and I'll use the term here, that was given to me by one of the founders. They have to be in the sauce. They have to be available to be participating in the studies. And those are the people you want giving you that feedback on whether or not they would participate in your study. I think it's so strong. I can imagine some answers to your question based on intuition and me having conducted multiple clinical trials. But I think the most important thing is that I'm not that person with a spinal cord injury. And so let's go ask them. What I do know is I want to make it as easy and fruitful as possible for you to do that. So I want you to know how it's going to go. I want you to know what you're going to get out of it in terms of a deliverable. And so it's going to be an engagement of this duration. And at the end, you're going to get a templated action minute summary on these topics. And so that you can come in, you can do that thing, you can get the response, and then you can go design your trial. So
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps.
David,
Hey, Dr. Nash.
first of all, very nice and appreciated and important. So, thank you for the time commitment and colleagues. I see Ryan and, I heard Anson's voice. So, this is really, really good and really, really important and needed. Two questions or I guess statements. One predates any hurricane and the other antedates any hurricane. I'm an Andrew survivor. Andrew was supposed to hit Aventura as ground zero with 150 mile an hour winds. I evacuated North Bay Village where I lived and went to Kendall. And just not too far from 152nd Street Coral Way, which was 150 mile an hour winds. Every window in the condo I was living in or house sitting blew out and the roof lifted off. In the last 4 hours, I sat in the bathroom between the toilet and the tub and prayed that I didn't get 150 because 125 was enough. How do we convince people, okay, not just to have supplies, be prepared, make a plan, but of the fury of these storms? Because as great as the National Hurricane Center is, the spaghetti models are an inexact science, okay? And you can't know what this is until you sat through one and your house is blowing apart and then you really don't know what to do. So that was number one. Number two, let's go all the way to the end. After you have all this damage, and we found out in Andrew and we found out in Wilma in 2006, because Katrina never really hit us. It went around, the basin. How do you get your house fixed? How do you not get ripped off? How do you deal with contractors? Okay, how do we use the resources of people who are so well connected in this Miami project, starting with Dr. Green, okay, to make sure that this is done properly and without being taken advantage of and not taking 2 years of living in whatever, okay, could be squalor, to get your life back together again.
So there's a lot of work to be done here. You identified in your first question something that there was really a theme throughout anecdotally that wasn't captured in the data, which is this kind of learned helplessness, where I'm going to do is from the people with spinal cord injuries, and this is captured in the podcast episode when we interview a high profile community member named Sabrina Cohen about her experiences with hurricanes. And she's born and raised Miami. She's been here the whole time. And she's kind of like, you know what, I'm going to hunker in my condo, and if the big one hits, it hits. And there's this kind of, I don't know how to quantify it aside from this learned hopelessness that I think really needs to be addressed, because I showed you the spaghetti plot and there's 50 impacts on land in Florida, but I think only 4 of those were in Dade County. A very low number. So people get accustomed to this. Oh, it's not going to hit. It's not going to hit until it hits.
Exactly.
And then I'm gonna be a guy with the chainsaw trying to get people out of their houses. And so, yes, we do need to address that. The second question, engage CIL, Center for Independent Living, South Florida. Ryan Gebauer, the president of Broward, is a licensed real estate agent. We need these experts in this area to combine with our access to resources, like you said. So we have the resources. And then if we can get the housing experts, because rebuilding is one thing, but rebuilding with adaptive necessities in the home is a whole different thing. So I don't know how to address both of those right now, but that's,
And
I guess
also
we'll start with
it's-
U-Link funding.
Yeah, there's only 3 routes of egress from South Florida. That's 95, 75, and the Turnpike, and they're a disaster.
Yeah.
Especially once the tolls are taken off by the governor to get everyone out. And it takes 7 or 8 hours to evacuate driving up State Road 7. My neighbor tried it at the last hurricane and sat for hours at one light. So, again, what the fury of these, until you have experienced it, is nothing that you can imagine. And I certainly haven't built my new home to think about that, and with a much healthier respect for what came along and what I thought was going to come along.
Yep. And we can swim away.
Float away.
All right. If we have no more questions, not sure what the end of presentation etiquette is, but we can probably wrap everything up.
Thank you, David.
Iggy, Maria?
Talk, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
How about, are the Pacific shelters in South Florida that are specifically adapted for a spinal cord injury community? And is that widely disseminated among the population? I don't know.
So there are generic shelters for disability. Those shelters have some major constraints. So like I was sharing, one participant went to those, was put on what he identified as an army bed and developed pressure sores. There's no privacy. So if you're going to do your catheterization, you're going to do it in public in front of the rest of the people there, much less your bowel routine. No one's given me a plausible solution to that in the shelter. And then these shelters, you can only enter with one caregiver. So if you have a family, there's a specific example of this. We interview this person in the podcast. They have 3 kids. It's either pick your wife as your caregiver and your kids are alone, or pick one of your kids, because only 2 of you can enter that special needs shelter. And so, or find a friend. Right? So the shelters do exist. They're generally adhering to or catering to a population different than spinal cord injury. So like from that universal design standpoint, they're not catering to a level of need required, especially by people with cervical spinal cord injuries. So they're leaving out a lot of the needs. And so because of that, people just avoid them. And then the burden is on them to evacuate, like Dr. Nash was saying, which can be a mess, or to stay and have that learned helplessness kind of response. Like, I hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I was thinking the university or the new Lynn Center would be a perfect place maybe to have a facility, but I don't think the university likes that. In fact, they always ask us to make sure, people do not come in and try to make that a safe place, space for them. But anyway, something we have to talk about. Great talk, very important.
Yeah, thank you.
About knock on wood, so far got a pretty good season, so hopefully we'll keep up.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.